Welcome to our channel. Today we take an emotional journey into the life and tragic end of Patsy Cline, the groundbreaking country music star whose voice and songs captivated millions. Known as one of the most iconic figures in music history, Patsy's life was filled with triumphs, heartbreaks, and an unrelenting passion for her craft. Her untimely death shocked the world, but her legacy continues to inspire generations. Join us as we uncover the story behind the voice that changed country music forever. Patsy Cline entered the world in 1932, born to a father who would bring more sorrow into her life than comfort, and a mother whose own hardships left her conflicted, but determined to protect her children. From day one, the deck seemed stacked against Virginia Jenny Hensley, later to be known as Patsy. Her father, Samuel Hensley, was a 41-year-old widower with children from another marriage and a penchant for cruelty that would darken Jenny's life in more ways than one. His marriage to Jenny's mother, Hilda, took place when Hilda was just 16. Their union was hardly a romance for the ages. Over time, they moved all around Virginia, 19 times in total, chasing one ill-fated job opportunity after another. Samuel's favorite pastime was imposing terror upon the family, and Patsy, as the oldest daughter, often ended up directly in the path of his rage. As she matured, that brutality left invisible scars on her soul. If you've ever listened to one of her heartbreaking ballads and wondered where that rawness came from, you only have to look back on those adolescent years of fear and survival. When she was 13, life took a sudden turn. Some might say for the worse, and others might say it was one step toward her destiny. Rheumatic fever and severe throat infections put her in the hospital. In those days, without the modern medicine we're lucky to have now, rheumatic fever could be quite deadly. For a moment, it did appear that her life might end right there, in a sterile room lined with worried nurses and the hum of outdated medical equipment. Her heart actually stopped. Everyone around her braced themselves for the worst. But then, somehow, the aspiring singer came back from the brink. When she finally opened her eyes and opened her mouth, her voice had changed. That near-death experience gave her vocals a raw, husky depth nobody had heard from her before. Yet good fortune rarely traveled alone in Patsy's world. She had just started recovering from her illness when her father decided he'd had enough. Samuel walked out on the family for good, leaving Hilda with 3 children and no consistent means of support. Patsy was 15, forced to drop out of school to help put food on the table. She did everything from waitressing to the grim task of chicken butchering, whatever it took to keep her younger siblings and mother afloat. The reality of poverty was closing in around her, but there was something else burning in her soul, some unstoppable dream that refused to die. Patsy wanted to be a singer, a real singer. Growing up in the 1930s and 1940s, especially in the rural South, wasn't exactly a place teeming with opportunities for a woman to just walk onto a stage and get discovered. But that didn't deter her. She decided the only way out was to force the door open herself, and so began the relentless pursuit of her big break. At 15, still practically a child, she somehow secured an audition for the Grand Ole Opry, which at that time was like the holy grail for any aspiring country star. Of course, traveling from their part of Virginia to Nashville cost money they didn't have. Hilda and Patsy decided to go anyway. They slept in a city park with no roof over their heads. Then they got ghosted. No follow-up, no invitation, no lucky star shining on them that day. Patsy's dream felt more out of reach than ever, but if anything, that heartbreak just made her fight harder. She spent years lugging her mother along to any venue that would offer her a few minutes on stage. Dive bars, small clubs, roadside honky-tonks. Patsy was there, belting out songs that made strangers lean in and ask, Who on earth is that? By midnight, she'd be done, only to collapse in bed for a few hours before waking up at dawn for a job that actually paid the bills. Patsy, though, transformed that exhaustion into grit. She kept telling the skeptics, "Just you wait. I'm going to be a star. I will sing on the Grand Ole Opry. I'll make records, and everybody is going to know my name." Yet love can appear in unexpected ways. In one of the local bands, Patsy performed with Bill Pear's Melody Boys and Girls. She met Bill Pear, a band leader who would not only become her manager, but also a complicated presence in her life. He believed in her, poured his energy and money into seeing her shine, and yes, also became intimately involved with her. Some might have called it fate, others might have called it a messy tangle of love and ambition. Either way, Bill was a man consumed by Patsy. He loved her talent. He wanted her on stage, in the recording studio, and frankly, in his arms. The trouble was that Bill was already married and had a child. None of that seemed to slow him down. He declared he was ready to divorce, but Patsy saw Bill's devotion as something purely beneficial for her music career, not a ticket to eternal romance. Love him? Not exactly. Need him, at least for a while? Absolutely. But Bill had no monopoly on Patsy's affections. Along came Gerald Klein, a short, stout fellow who showed up at one of her gigs and instantly fell under her spell. For Patsy, it might not have been real love at first sight, but Gerald's seemingly solid finances were more tempting than many would admit. Rumor has it, she thought marrying him might rescue her from the constant threat of poverty. She was done living a life of never knowing where the next meal would come from. Before you could blink, they were married, to the shock of Bill and just about everyone else in her circle. But the rosy glow wore off quickly when Patsy discovered that Gerald wasn't actually rolling in money. He just worked for the family's construction company rather than owning it. Their relationship took on the same tension that had haunted Patsy from childhood. She wanted freedom, space, and the chance to chase her dream without interference, whereas Gerald expected her to stay home, cook, and be the dutiful wife. Patsy's response was basically, "I'm Patsy Cline, and don't you forget it." The tension ratcheted up another notch when she refused to cut ties with Bill Pear, and when Gerald turned out not to be so squeaky clean himself. He had his own extracurricular interests. The marriage soon unraveled. Enter Charlie Dick. He was 2 years younger than Patsy, which felt like a breath of fresh air after her involvement with older, more controlling men. Like Patsy, Charlie knew tragedy. He was 15 when his father took his own life, a trauma that left a permanent scar. Yet somehow, when Charlie caught sight of Patsy performing, it was electric. He felt something that soared beyond mere admiration. He had to have her. She might have resisted for a moment, out of habit or caution, but that didn't last long. Patsy was also drawn to Charlie's blend of softness and wildness. She was ready to leave Gerald behind once and for all, especially when she landed a spot on the Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts show and needed to pack for New York. In January 1957, Patsy stepped onto that stage with all the hunger and thirst of someone who has glimpsed a better future but can't quite grasp it. Walking After Midnight poured out of her in that newly polished, deeply emotive voice of hers. The audience erupted, and the show's applause meter soared. This was the big break she had clawed her way toward for years, and it felt absolutely monumental. Of course, success in the spotlight triggered a less than triumphant finale to her marriage with Gerald, who swiftly filed for divorce as if to say, "Okay, you had your little dream, and now we're done." Between the heartbreak of her failed marriage and the promise of a new relationship with Charlie, Patsy found herself with a brand new stage name, Patsy, a nickname Bill Pear had suggested, plus the last name Cline from Gerald, which she would keep, ironically, for the rest of her life. The personal drama was a swirl of half-truths and heartbreak, but professionally, her path was about to rocket into territory no one had predicted. She used her friend Bill's resources just enough to keep moving forward, but Charlie soon took center stage in her life. He proposed, she accepted, and off they went into what Patsy hoped would be a better existence. Her mother, Hilda, was not convinced. She had watched her daughter cycle through one controlling man after another, and Charlie, with his love of late nights, drinking, and gambling, had the potential to be another heartbreak waiting to happen. Patsy, stubborn as always, went forward with the wedding in September 1957 despite her mother's misgivings. We all know the saying, love is blind, but marriage is an eye-opener. It certainly proved true here. Charlie could be downright charming when sober, but the darker side of his personality showed itself under the influence of alcohol. Words became sharper, tempers flared, and eventually the arguments escalated into something worse. In a culture where domestic violence often went unspoken and unpunished, Patsy found herself trapped in a cycle she couldn't easily break. She'd threatened to leave, or actually leave for a few days, only to return when he sobered up, apologized, and asked for forgiveness. 2 children arrived, giving her even more reason to stay. As she tried to juggle gigs, motherhood, and an increasingly turbulent marriage, it seemed that one part of her life soared while the other dragged her down. On the career front, at least, things had never looked brighter. She finally got a new manager, Randy Hughes, who guided her in making strategic moves to elevate her name from small local star to national phenomenon. She found a better label, reconnected with the Grand Ole Opry, and took the music industry by storm with hits like I Fall to Pieces. We might imagine that at this point she'd be able to relax, enjoy the fruits of her labor, buy a comfortable home, and watch the money roll in. But life rarely gave Patsy Cline any break. If there was a whisper of good fortune, there was a louder echo of impending doom following right behind it. In 1961, fate struck again in a violent way. Patsy was in a car with her brother Sam when they collided head-on with another vehicle. The force of the crash hurled Patsy straight into the windshield, leaving her with gruesome injuries. Yet, even in that nightmarish moment, her generosity and compassion shone through. She urged the paramedics to help the passengers in the other car first, insisting that she herself was all right. The chilling truth, however, was that 2 people in the other vehicle didn't survive, and Patsy was inches from death. Doctors weren't sure she would pull through, and if she did, they said, her face might be permanently disfigured. It was the kind of news that would level any other rising star. But Patsy Cline refused to surrender. Then came what she described as her near-death encounter. Waking up after surgery, battered and bandaged, she told Charlie that Jesus had been in the operating room, holding her hand, telling her it wasn't her time. Some people didn't believe a word of it, but Patsy insisted she had more to do in this world. Sure enough, just 6 weeks later, she strapped herself up in crutches and got back into the studio, determined to keep the momentum going. Heard or not, she recorded Crazy, arguably her biggest hit and a timeless anthem that still resonates with listeners today. Although physically she was in pain, vocally she seemed unstoppable. Patsy became famous for her offstage grit as well. She had learned the hard way not to trust promoters who promised payment after the show. Her motto? No dough, no show. It was simple, direct, and very Patsy Cline. She defied the norms of a male-dominated industry by standing her ground. Many men were startled to see a woman demanding what she was owed, refusing to step on stage until she had proof she wouldn't be cheated. Promoters might scramble, the audience might get restless, but Patsy would not back down. She earned the nickname The Cline, someone not to be messed with. She was tough and unapologetic, but she also had a heart of gold for those she trusted and loved. Among those she took under her wing was Loretta Lynn, another singer from a hardscrabble background, who found in Patsy a mentor, protector, and friend. The generosity that was so absent from Patsy's childhood home was precisely what she offered Loretta and other emerging female artists. If you wanted to see how truly kind she was, you just had to watch how she covered Loretta's living expenses, or how she'd throw dinner parties and insist on paying for everything. In an industry often known for cutthroat competition, Patsy's generosity was both refreshing and extraordinary. Patsy was invited to perform at a charity concert in Kansas City. It was meant to raise money for the family of another disc jockey who had died, and she agreed wholeheartedly. Getting there meant flying on a small plane owned by her manager, Randy Hughes, who had recently become enamored with aviation. The plan was for them to return immediately after the shows, but the weather was terrible. Low visibility, high winds, the sort of conditions that would make an experienced pilot think twice. Randy, however, was not an experienced pilot. He barely had his license with about 160 hours in the air, and he wasn't trained to fly solely by instruments, which is precisely what you need to do in poor weather. Friends pleaded with Patsy to drive back rather than fly, or to wait until the skies were less threatening. Patsy apparently had made an eerie comment. "I've had 2 bad accidents. The third one will either be the charm or kill me." After finishing the charity concert, Randy insisted the weather was fine enough to make the trip. Patsy, along with 2 other passengers, fellow country singers Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas, boarded the small plane. They made one brief landing in Dyersburg, Tennessee to refuel. The airfield manager begged them not to continue because conditions were horrendous. They refused, saying it was just a short hop to Nashville. Panic set in as word spread that the aircraft was missing. By the next day, search parties were combing the area. Locals in Camden, Tennessee, reported hearing a plane going down. Eventually, the wreckage was found in a wooded area. The small plane had crashed nose first, leaving no survivors. Patsy Cline, the unstoppable warrior of country music, was gone at just 30 years old. The day was March 5th, 1963, forever etched into the story of American music. When the news broke, countless fans were devastated. Headlines called it the day country music died, referencing Patsy's central place in the genre's heart. Crowds at her funeral in Winchester, Virginia, were enormous, so large that some of her genuine friends and family struggled to get through, as fans and onlookers thronged the area. Even the burial was chaotic, with people trying to take flowers straight off the casket. It was a horrendous spectacle, one that spoke both to the deep public affection for Patsy and the lack of boundaries that some onlookers displayed in their own grief. For Charlie Dick, losing Patsy was the final blow to what small hold on stability he had left. He sank into a state of near madness, refusing to move her belongings from their home, clinging to her presence in ways that disturbed even those close to him. He would blast her music at all hours. When his new wife eventually begged him to turn it off, he'd scream, "She's not dead. She can't be." The ghost of Patsy loomed over him, too real and too untouchable all at once. An unsettling twist to this tragedy is that Patsy, known for her psychic hunches and superstitions, had already created a will back in April of 1961, nearly 2 years before the crash. In it, she left almost everything to her mother and her children. Charlie was left only with their car. Had she survived, that detail might have changed, but it speaks to just how prepared she was for the worst. Patsy had told friends more than once about premonitions of an early death, reflecting that her father's cruelty, her near-fatal illnesses, and her horrific car accident had all been omens or warnings. She had escaped her fate so many times that she half expected not to escape again. In the years immediately after her death, the rapidly changing trends in music might have buried her legacy under new styles and new faces. The 1960s saw rock music gaining ground. The 1970s introduced new waves of country and pop crossovers, and one could argue that Patsy Cline might have been forgotten. But by the early 1980s, a revival of interest in classic country, along with re-released albums and a 1985 biopic titled Sweet Dreams, caused a massive resurgence in Patsy's popularity. Younger generations heard those timeless tracks, Crazy and I Fall to Pieces, and they wanted to know more about the woman behind them. Leading the charge to preserve her memory was her daughter, Julie Dick, who lost her mother at only 4 years old. Julie grew up hearing stories about Patsy, from old photos, from her mother's music that still played on the radio, and from a blossoming community of fans. She pieced together a portrait of the woman she barely got to know. She has repeatedly said she's in awe of the distinction between the mom she remembers in faint childhood glimpses and Patsy Cline, the legend with a voice that refuses to let your heart go once you've heard it. Julie has spent decades ensuring the world never stops listening. Patsy Cline's life was a story of resilience, ambition, and undeniable talent. Despite her challenges and a career cut far too short, she left an enduring legacy that continues to influence music today. Her timeless songs and trailblazing spirit remind us why she remains an icon in both country and pop music. If you were moved by Patsy's story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of music's greatest legends. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.